Good evening and welcome to our discussion of our behavior change replication project. I am Brandon Gillespie.
I'm Megan Cristello.
And I'm Kasha Moore.
And I'm Stephanie Shaw.
All right, now that we've introduced ourselves, welcome again to our discussion about our study about reducing caffeine consumption. We'll spend the next half hour discussing the specific study that we chose, what the results look like and after our replication, and the conclusions and limitations of our work. Getting us started with a review of the study we chose is Megan.
Thanks, Brandon. I'll be covering the literature review, the participants, the setting, and the materials that were used in the replication study. Caffeine is considered to be one of the most widely used drugs in the world. Caffeine is defined as a drug because it stimulates the central nervous system, causing increased alertness. Caffeine gives most people a temporary energy boost and elevates mood. Frary et al. Reported that in the United States, more than 85% of adults and adolescents consume caffeine foods and beverages daily. It was found that most American adults consume on average 280 milligrams of caffeine each day. According to Knight et al., caffeine intake varies across different types of beverages and different populations. Coffee is most typically consumed by adults and contains more caffeine than other beverages. Carbonated soft drinks, teas, and energy drinks also contribute to caffeine intake and are favored by adolescents. Children aged 6 to 14 commonly consume caffeine through carbonated drinks, while energy drinks and energy shots are preferred by teens and college students. Recent studies have shown caffeine to be a mild reinforcer and that some individuals have trouble lowering consumption despite having medical issues that are heightened by caffeine. Some of those health issues included high blood pressure, rapid heart rate, and digestive issues. The source study stated that there is debate whether or not caffeine truly causes a risk factor to health. There are mixed opinions stating that caffeine consumption holds both harmful and beneficial effects. Moderate caffeine consumption has been shown to cause short-term benefits such as attention and enhanced performance. Caffeine used in lower doses are effective in combating sleepiness. However, caffeine in high doses have been shown to cause headaches, anxiety, and sleep deprivation. Many individuals have taken steps to reduce their caffeine intake, but doing so can produce withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms can interfere with day-to-day functions and can include severe headaches, difficulty concentrating, irritability, depressed mood, or even flu-like symptoms. These symptoms can last anywhere between 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on the amount of caffeine previously consumed. It was suggested by Mary Sweeney, an instructor who researches caffeine effects on individuals in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins University, that the best way to reduce caffeine consumption is to gradually reduce intake over a period of days or weeks. In the source study, baseline data was collected for 1 week, and then collected data was used to design an intervention. Interventions using gradual reduction of caffeine consumption levels daily were chosen to lessen the withdrawal symptoms. The intervention was implemented in 3 stages. With each behavior modification change, the amount of caffeine that was able to be consumed was reduced by approximately 50%. Caffeine consumption was reduced to planned levels, and the reduction was shown as significant. During the intervention, tiredness and headaches were frequently reported. Findings suggest that the intervention was successful. I'll now share with you the participants and the setting of the study, as well as the materials used. Our replication study included 4 participants, 3 females and 1 male, who all consumed moderate to high consumptions of caffeine. Participants were Megan Cristello, Brandon Gillespie, Kasha Moore, and Stephanie Shaw. All of the participants are graduate students earning an online degree in applied behavior analysis from Ball State University. All participants were not familiar with each other prior to the course or prior to the completion of the study. All participants lived in different states and the Eastern time zone. Data was collected at various times by each participant over the course of several weeks, at home, work, or anywhere participants consumed caffeine. All participants shared that they were interested in reducing their daily caffeine consumption. The materials for the study included a behavioral interview that included 12 questions to determine how each participant felt about his or her caffeine consumption and the situations in which it occurred, any perceived function, and the benefits of reduction in caffeine. Other materials included a computer, phone, or printed behavior recording form to record data. The behavioral recording form was used to record the amount of caffeine consumed daily, as well as withdrawal effects of tiredness and headaches. All participants consumed a variety of caffeinated beverages daily, which consisted of coffee, tea, carbonated soft drinks, and energy drinks. Each participant had access to a shared folder in Google Drive for sharing IOA and fidelity checks and with other group members. The participants also had a forum on Google Hangouts where all communication was recorded.
All right, thanks, Megan. So I'll be covering the behavior definition, data collection, and the study's design, and also baseline and the treatment phases. First, let me begin with the behavior definition that was used for our replication study. The behavior definition for caffeine consumption was defined as any instance of ingesting any beverage, food, or supplement that contained at least 1 milligram of caffeine. Some examples of this behavior will be drinking a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or an energy drink, or any carbonated beverage as well. Some non-examples would include drinking a cup of water, a cup of orange juice, or taking a multivitamin. As for the data collection, we collected data using event recording to track the amount of caffeine consumed in milligrams. Each participant used a caffeine consumption behavior diary to track his or her consumption. Participants recorded each time they consumed at least 1 milligram of caffeine through all phases. They tracked the time, the date, the amount of caffeine, and what was consumed. Caffeine consumption was tracked and recorded 7 days a week for a total of 6 weeks. Along with recording caffeine consumption, each participant also tracked any daily headaches, tiredness using frequency data. As for the design of our study, we used a single subject A/B design. We used that for our replication study. The design allowed us to measure caffeine consumption before the intervention, during the baseline, and during the intervention. The baseline occurred over the course of 1 week, where each participant recorded their caffeine intake using a caffeine consumption behavior diary. The diary was set up to record ABC data on caffeine consumption. Participants recorded the date, time, and type of beverage and how much caffeine was consumed in milligrams. Moving on to the intervention phases. Once the baseline data was gathered, the intervention began with a 12-question behavioral interview of each participant. With questions, these questions were structured pretty much the same as the FBA. The purpose of the interview was to figure out the function of the caffeine consumption and recommend a possible alternative behavior. The intervention phase lasted 5 weeks with 3 stages. Stage 1 was during week 2, stage 2 was during week 3, and stage 3 was week 4 through 6. It required that each participant, and the intervention also required that each participant lower their caffeine consumption during baseline, and it was different for each participant. So during the intervention, each participant had their caffeine consumption cut in half in stage 1, and then again in stage 2, and then again in stage 3. All the participants recorded caffeine consumption using the behavior diary.
Thanks, Tasha. I'll discuss the IOA data and treatment integrity portions of our study. In the original study that was replicated, IOA data was not taken. In order to incorporate IOA data in our replication, our group came together and brainstormed different ways this could be done. Considering all participants live in different states, real-time IOA data would prove to be difficult to obtain. Instead, our IOA data was collected by conducting behavioral interviews through the use of live video recording via Google Hangouts. A letter scale was created in order to identify the function of caffeine consumption based on the answers provided by each participant. The letter scale is as follows. A was for attention, E was for escape, ACC was for access to tangibles or activities, and auto was for automatic. Once the interview questions were completed, participants compared their scores according to the letter scale and utilized the formula number of agreements over 12 times 100. Our findings concluded that 100% of our participants' function of caffeine intake was due to automatic reinforcement. For our treatment integrity, when conducting this study replication, each participant was required to decrease caffeine consumption in half for 1 week, for week 1, week 2, and week 3. By week 3, participants should remain at the caffeine level for the remainder of the intervention. Each participant took daily data on their caffeine intake by recording the type of caffeine source and how many milligrams of caffeine it contained. Participants also recorded factors such as tiredness, productivity, and instances of headaches. Some factors that could interfere with the integrity of our treatment are how data is collected and caffeine standards. Since each participant implemented the intervention within different states, it is assumed that everyone took accurate data on their intake of caffeine. However, there is no way to prove 100% accuracy. The original study was also done using Australian standards when it came to measuring the amounts of caffeine. Although we came up with our own standards to fit American measurements, some caffeine products may have contained different levels of caffeine despite the amount of milligrams ingested. In order to conduct a more accurate study in the future, it may be helpful for all participants to be located in the same area and agree to assign the same types of brands of caffeine before starting the intervention.
Thank you for the fantastic summary of our research and our application. So, to get started, here are the results that we saw across all 4 of our participants. Participant 1 was Megan. We saw a very inconsistent baseline of caffeine consumption, averaging out to about 115 milligrams per day. As you can see on the graph on the left, there is a little bit of a spike. This could be attributed to the fact that she was sick on her vacation. Sickness could have reduced the amount of caffeine that she would have wanted to consume. What was observed after the baseline was a very consistent decrease in caffeine consumption overall, with a couple days spread out throughout the study where she drifted above the criteria line before dropping back down. In terms of headaches, the graphs on the right side, her headaches were very consistent. She had a baseline of 3 days, and these headache days decreased down to 2 headaches per day. A different trend was observed with tiredness, however, as the baseline began at 4 days during the week and steadily decreased until week 4, where it began trending upward. And in week 6, we saw the number of headache days go up to 5, which was above the baseline. Tiredness results are consistent with caffeine withdrawal symptoms, as mentioned earlier. Moving on to her performance rating graph, the baseline presented a range of 6 to 8, which is a pretty productive view of one's day. And while there was some variance, the range only expanded between 5 and 9 during the intervention. The productivity that Megan reported indicates that for her, there may have been a link between caffeine and productivity, as there are more dips in the perception of performance. Moving on to participant 2, which is myself, Brandon. My baseline data for caffeine consumption was the most similar to the original study in terms of the amount of caffeine consumed. And much like the original study, my own caffeine consumption was successfully reduced significantly using only the replacement strategy and a restriction on the amount to be consumed. There was only 1 day after the baseline in which I consumed more caffeine than I was allowed by the criteria, and that was the first day of the intervention. Going from an average consumption floating around 200 milligrams per day down to under 30 milligrams per day is a significant change. The headache days data was particularly interesting as it shows a consistency with the symptoms of caffeine withdrawal. I had started with only 1 headache day in the baseline week, saw similar numbers in week 2, and then had a major spike to 5 headache days during week 3. There was also an interesting trend in tiredness data, which steadily decreased from 6 days in baseline to 2 days in weeks 3 and 4, getting as low as 1 day. It did rebound back to 4 days in the final week of the study. This trend is interesting because it could also show a potential confound to the effectiveness of our intervention. If there were less days where I felt tired, it's possible that the reinforcement value of caffeine was lessened. and there was less reason to consume it. Finally, the performance rating data showed a lot of variability across the study, showing the interesting trend of having both the highest 10 and lowest rating 2 after caffeine reduction was introduced. There did not appear to be a trend related to caffeine consumption with this data. Participant 3, Kasha, started with an average of 160 milligrams per day throughout the baseline phase. After the selection of her criteria for week 1, she reduced her caffeine consumption at each stage of the study with no issues. There were no days above the selected criteria line, and she saw the most day of 0 rates across all of participants. Headache data began with a baseline of 1 and had a steady increase the next 3 weeks before lowering again at the end of the study. Tiredness followed the same general pattern, starting at 2 and trending upwards the next 3 weeks before lowering at the end. Both tiredness and headache data do show signs of caffeine withdrawal, as you can see, both start to lower, spike up in the middle weeks, and then return back to low levels in the final 2 weeks of the study. The most interesting data to dissect from Kasha's graphs comes from her performance rating. With a baseline average of just over 5 per day, clearly increased as the study went on. Looking at the graph, it is a steady upward trend as the amount of caffeine was reduced. This could be an interesting thing to examine in the future. Participant 4, Stephanie, began with a baseline average of 190 milligrams per day, another person that was pretty close to the original study. Of all participants, Stephanie's caffeine consumption was the most variable and inconsistent after we began recording data. In phase 1, she had 2 days where she was above the caffeine criteria she set, and this trend continued into phase 2. In phase 3, Stephanie was under the criteria number 9 days out of a possible 21, including a spike to 350 milligrams, a level that matched the highest caffeine consumption during her baseline. Despite this, Stephanie still successfully reduced her caffeine consumption from the beginning of the study. This inconsistency and the 1 spike day both help to explain the lack of caffeine withdrawal appearance in the tiredness and headache data shown on the right. Headaches were the most consistent data across all participants, with a range between 1 and 2 days for all 6 weeks. Tiredness days were the highest for Stephanie during the baseline in week 6, with consistent weeks of 2 days in the middle 3 weeks of the study. Finally, the performance rating data shows a similar inconsistency to the caffeine consumption, as the range for baseline was between 4 and 6, whereas the range for the intervention phase was between 3 and 8. On the next slide here, we have a visual breakdown of all the averages and ranges across the 4 measures we used during the study. Some interesting trends include a fairly variable range of caffeine consumption between baseline and end of study. As you can see, almost all of the participants ranged somewhere between 0 and as high as 350 milligrams. The average caffeine consumption numbers matched the graphical conclusions from before, showing Kasha reduced her caffeine consumption the most, whereas Stephanie did the least. All right, to finish up this presentation, we'd kind of like to touch on some of the limitations of our replication. The biggest confound that we encountered is that one of our group members dropped the class in the middle of the semester with no communication to the group. In doing so, we lost a set of data and a participant to our study. In addition to this, we also lost an additional person to aid in the collection of IOA. Our second limitation is access to technology. In the original study, the study uses blood work to further test the effects of eliminating caffeine from one's life, measuring things such as levels of triglycerides and many fancy medical terms that none of us really understand. Because we're all college students, we did not have access to this type of measurement, which limits our ability to fully recreate the results of the study. In addition, we were also limited by the distance between us. Because all of us are spread out across states, we did not have the ability to conduct more in-depth IOA procedures. We could not conduct behavioral interviews in person and so on. We were also on a deadline for the class. Because of this, the results are not as complete as the results from the original study. The original study had a couple more weeks worth of intervention data. This could have allowed for more stabilization of the results, more opportunity for normal weeks for Stephanie, or to not be sick in the case of Megan. On both of these notes, it is worth noting that another limitation arises simply from the individual physiological challenges that we all encounter, such as illness, more extreme sleep deprivation, anything like that. These are not normal conditions for any of the participants involved. And if there were any days across the entirety of the study where somebody couldn't sleep or where there was a particularly stressful day at work, we can't control for these, but the results may have looked differently if everybody had 6 perfectly normal weeks. As I mentioned, external factors such as job stress and schoolwork are something we can't control for. I know personally that my own numbers were partially impacted by these things. I may have had 6 very stress-free weeks that were light in schoolwork when the study was happening. When this is the case, there is less reason to consume caffeine because I'm able to sleep and I don't need that reinforcement of caffeine consumption. So bringing everything together, caffeine consumption was reduced across all participants in our replication. This is consistent with the original study's results that saw the combination of intervention and changing criterion design. In addition, we observed caffeine withdrawal symptoms in 3 out of 4 participants. Caffeine withdrawal was one of the biggest things that was trying to be controlled for, that the design was chosen to reduce caffeine consumption in levels. The dangers of rapid reduction are well researched, and the fact that we did see them, albeit reduced, confirmed the necessity of this decision. In terms of replication efforts, we did a great job overall of making the study as close to the original as we could. The main diversion from the original, as I mentioned earlier, was our inability to access blood testing. Other than that, however, we accurately reproduced the methods and overall goals of the study. All right, so thank you for joining us tonight on our exploration of our replication product. Have a great night.